Okay, so good afternoon and welcome. My name is Kevin Kettleson, a Community Development Specialist with the Upper Minnesota Valley Regional Development Commission. Just want to welcome you all to our second webinar in a series of 4 around the topic of planning and funding infrastructure projects. As I mentioned last time, water and sewer infrastructure planning funding has been a consistent top concern for our communities and counties in the region. And our intent with these webinars is to provide you with some an overview of the various tools and sources out there that can help you plan and fund large capital expenditures. So last month, our webinar focused on project planning and budgeting. If you missed it, feel free to check out our YouTube page to watch the recording. If you just search UMVRDC YouTube on Google, you should find it. And I'll send out a link when I send out the materials for today's session too. So be sure to check that out. So today's session is an overview on bonding, including the different types of bonds, some key terms, the process, who all's involved. And we're happy to have Rebecca and Keith from Eller's Public Finance Advisors join us again today to present this information. If you have any questions during the session, feel free to just drop them in the chat and I'll kind of watch those. And then we'll also have some time at the end of the session to take any questions live as well. So with that, I think we'll get things started here with Keith and Rebecca. So guys, take it away.
All right. Thank you. I'll kick it off for us. Again, Rebecca Kurtz with Ellers and with my coworker Keith Dahl. Both of us are municipal advisors. If you're not familiar, Ellers is a municipal advisory firm and works with communities on as we'll be talking today, municipal debt, planning for issuing debts. So like the long-term financial planning, or if you're issuing utility debt, utility rate analysis, and then also on kind of all aspects, I'll say, of economic development. So a lot of TIF and everything that goes along with tax increment. But we'll spend the next hour today talking about bonding and municipal debt. And so with that, we'll take it away here. So like I said, we'll talk about municipal debt 101. There we go. And really talk about just some of the key concepts. We'll go through some of the terms that we use and what they mean. So if you get into the bonding project and some of the jargon that is related to that, we will talk about the team that is usually part of a municipal debt deal, and then just the different kinds of debt and the process. And I will say with this, we're going to hit on what is most common. So there's other types of debt that, you can get into with revenue deals and some more specialty things. But today, really focusing on what would be common if you were issuing debt for like street utility type projects. All right, so just maybe to kick it off, like why would you even issue debt or borrow? With that, a lot of times with debt, we issue because we don't have the cash on hand, and we'll talk about a couple different ways to finance projects generally, but typically, they're large capital projects. In order to issue debt, you need to have authority. And there are different types of authority depending on what kind of project you are issuing debt for. So it is a different statutory authority if you are purchasing equipment such as like fire trucks and police cars. You use another section of Minnesota statutes if you're doing like a city hall or other government type facilities and issuing debt. And then what you might be maybe a little more familiar with or use more frequently would be what we call improvement bonds or 429 bonds, which is the statutory authority for issuing a street if you're doing assessments with the street, or utility bonds, or 444, which again refers to the statute. If you're issuing debt for like water, sewer, stormwater, I know in a future session you'll be hearing from representatives with the Public Facilities Authority, or PFA. And with those types of debt, the authority typically is that 444 or utility authority. And then with that, there is a separate statute that you can refer to for refunding. So if you have debt that either you want to pay off early, or we're not really in the environment at the moment, but maybe you issue debt and several years later, there's an opportunity because interest rates have dramatically decreased, that you could refinance that. And so there's also authority to restructure your debt or refinance for a variety of reasons. But what we would typically see it for is lower interest rates. I will say right now, because a lot of the debt that maybe is eligible to be refunded right now, it's not really working because a lot of that debt was issued several years ago when we saw rates, at 1%, maybe 2%. And now we're seeing things more in the 3.5% range. But it's something to continue to monitor, and in the future, maybe there's going to be more opportunity. So while we're going to talk about issuing debt, which is the column on the third or far right today, a lot of times bonds are issued because you want to preserve your cash, or maybe you don't have cash on hand to fully fund a project. That means then that the asset, whether it be your equipment, your street, whatever, is amortized over a period of time. It cannot exceed the useful life. So, if you are issuing debt for, we'll say, a squad car for your police station, you're not able to issue debt for 20 years because the useful life of that car is not going to be 20 years. Typically, on street and infrastructure projects, that isn't an issue. And many times the term of the debt is shorter than what that useful life of your project is. But with that, another reason why debt may be issued is because you then have the people who are currently using the streets or benefiting from the fire truck paying for that asset. On the flip side, and the other extreme, so looking on the left side with cash and reserves, that would be funding projects, building up cash and using your existing cash or reserves to pay for your equipment or your street. It works well, and to the extent that you're able to do this, a lot of times it's very efficient for shorter lived assets. So maybe some of the equipment that has a shorter lifespan, or things like squad cars that you are regularly replacing, versus it's sometimes or many times difficult to save enough cash to pay for your street and utility project out of cash, especially if they're larger projects. The other reason why sometimes that pay-as-you-go or cash reserves option, something to keep in mind, is that it would be raising the taxes and using revenues that prior residents and businesses have paid to fund something into the future. So the argument can be made that the people who are paying for the new street or the new fire truck may not be benefiting from it because they are paying taxes today for something that may be purchased in 10 years. Those are really policy decisions. There's not necessarily a right or wrong way with that. But those are the two kind of extremes. Looking in the middle, the pay-as-you-use, idea again is interfund loans. And with this, a lot of times it's a loan between your funds. So maybe you are going to borrow from your water fund, which has a very healthy balance of cash, and you may use that, do an interfund loan to purchase, for example, your fire, or yeah, we'll say your fire truck. And so you would use those funds, existing cash, purchase your fire truck, but then still levy or pay back that fund that loaned the money. So we'll say your utility fund over time. You can pay it back with interest if you want. So it's going to be similar to the idea of debt, where you're going to be making annual payments back to the fund, but you would, if you have the cash to do it, would save some of the costs associated with issuing a bond. And with that, then again, with the interfund loan, it's really making sure that if you are going to fund and do that loan, it won't be at the detriment of the fund that's making the loan. But again, today we're really going to focus on the debt piece of it, or the bonding piece. Typically debt that cities issue, this is not all debt, but what we're going to focus on today is called tax exempt debt. Most municipal debt that is going to be used for a public purpose can be called, or can be tax exempt debt. And the reason why that is important is that the interest that's paid to the bondholders or the debt holders is generally exempt from federal and state income taxes. So there is a benefit to the bondholder to have this tax exempt municipal debt. That also is the reason why many times that municipal debt that you issue as a city is going to have a lower or more favorable interest rate than what a developer might be able to get debt for, or, you know, than what your mortgage is for at your house and things like that. You know, tax exemption can be that privilege. So along with that, of course, comes some rules that need to be abided by, including some federal regulations. And it is the US Treasury and the IRS that really enforce those regulations. So that's part of the reason why typically there is a team, which we're going to talk about, with that, is really making sure that as you go through that municipal debt process, that if you're issuing tax exempt debt, you're staying within those boundaries and not doing anything that's going to get the IRS or other federal agencies knocking on your door wanting to ask a lot of questions. It does note here, you know, municipal issuers can issue taxable debt. That includes a different set of rules, and we won't focus on that today, but I'll just say typically that taxable debt many times has an interest rate that may be between 1% to 2% higher, depending on specifics of the project. So what is a municipal bond? In short, you know, it's that debt instrument that you as a local government can use to finance and support your capital projects and equipment. It means that with a bond, you are making an obligation to make a payment and pay back the loan. There is going to be a stated principal amount. So it's going to say you have to pay back X amount per a certain schedule. And it's going to have a specific time frame for that. So it's going to mature on a specific date. And then with that, it also has that specific interest rate. So that rate can be fixed or it can be variable. I would say with most of the municipal debt that cities issue for, you know, your capital projects and your equipment, it is a fixed rate. it has been a really long time since I've worked on anything that has a variable interest rate, but that always would be an option depending on maybe the specifics. I would say for your typical, street utility building equipment project, I don't see a reason why you would take the risk of a variable rate. And so it's common and um, default to fixed typically.
Yeah, and I would just add with that, I mean, if you look over the last 20, 30 years with where rates have been, variable probably back then had some level of benefit to a community because the idea is, well, the rates are eventually going to go down. I don't want to lock into a fixed rate today when it's say 7 or 8%, but we're still in a low interest rate environment, and we have been for a long time. And so you don't want to enter into a variable rate transaction because most people anticipate rates are going to eventually go back up. So that's where you want your fixed rate is in low interest rate environment periods.
Absolutely. So types of debt, again, what is most common for municipalities is what we call general obligation debt. That typically we assume is going to have the lowest interest rate. And that is because it can be payable from any available source. So for example, on a street project, you might be using assessments and the tax levy. On a utility project, you might pledge all of your water revenues to make the debt payments. But along with whatever that payment source is, when general obligation debt is issued, the council also makes a pledge to levy taxes for that. They pledge their full faith and credit of the city. So if you issue general obligation water bonds, you may plan to use water revenues to pay the debt service, but with that general obligation, the council is saying, in the event water revenues are not sufficient, we will levy taxes to make that payment. So it's from the bondholder perspective, extremely secure. We do not see Minnesota cities defaulting on their general obligation bonds. And that's one of the reasons why typically those interest rates are very favorable and fairly low, is because there's a lot of security connected with that. Continuing down, there are some limited obligation options. I will say we don't see that very often, but again, that's starting to give a little less security. And then going to that revenue option below that, where either gross or net revenue is pledged. This would be maybe an example of a electric utility bond, where you are going to issue debt, but you are looking to use purely the revenues from that entity or that enterprise to pay the debt service on it. So with the revenue obligation, there is not that general obligation pledge, and there would be a decision to make, if those revenues were not sufficient, there'd be a decision for the city to make on how you wanted to address it. But from a bondholder perspective, the only promise the city makes is revenues from the enterprise would make the debt service. So with that, we typically see revenue debt have a little higher interest rate. And we'll talk about rating agencies, but pure revenue debt also typically has a slightly lower rating, just because, again, there's a little more risk associated with it. And then you can see on the bottom, the appropriation pledge. That is where you may have like an economic development authority issue debt for like a city hall project. And in this situation, the city then would appropriate money annually to make the debt service payment for those bonds. This also, from a bondholder perspective, is a little riskier because annually the city council decides whether or not they're going to set aside money to make that bond payment. When you are looking at projects like this, I would say that they're always going to be riskier, carry a little higher interest rate from the market or the bondholders. They do also look at it though and say, well, they are funding a police station and that's public service and a need of the community. So that is a lower risk than funding a brand new ice skating rink. And so things like that start to play into bonds where you are making an annual appropriation for the debt service. So as I mentioned, there needs to be legal authority to issue for each type of bonds, and along with that comes a little bit of some limitations. You can't just walk down to the bank and get a loan like you would for your mortgage or for your car. When you're looking at the authority, that refers back to really it's dictated by Minnesota statute, and the overall statute is chapter 475, and this is stuff that you don't need to remember and stay on top of. Your attorney and advisors can help walk you through that specifics, but it really outlines the procedural requirements. So for the example of issuing debt for streets with the assessments, it outlines what needs to be done in order to move forward with issuing 429 or improvement bonds for your streets. It also outlines, what kind of pledge that you're making. So what is going to be used to make the debt service payments. It outlines whether or not you need to take the project and the bond issue to the voters to get their approval, or if there are public hearings and other steps that may be needed. And with that, though, the state statute outlines the minimum steps that need to be done. There always can be additional steps or policies, either by charter or ordinance or city policy, on if you want to add additional restrictions. The other side of that with limits, a lot of times the limits maybe come more from policy or council direction, but the state does have a net debt limit, which basically is saying that the maximum debt that a city can issue is 3% of your value. With that, though, there are exceptions. So if you are using other resources such as assessment revenue, utility revenue, tax increment revenues, that debt does not count against your debt limit. So generally, and there always are, generally, I would say your improvement bonds for your street and your utility bonds that go along with that do not count against your debt limit. Your equipment or city halls would count against your debt limit. And there's some other exceptions, but those, from a general standpoint of the common issues communities do. There also are, I was just going to say there's some maximum terms with the statute that you can go up to 30 years from a practical side, unless it is a huge issue. We typically don't see that. I would say it's more common to have a maximum term of around 20 years. But again, that's really going to be some decisions based on what works for your community and the project as far as what is a comfortable annual debt service payment. And then again, with all of this, You can add as many other limits as you want through either your charter or policies that the community adopts. So I alluded to this. We are not going to cover every type of bond, but really kind of focus on some of the more common. I'm guessing many of you that are joining us today have maybe at some point or will at some point, if you're in a city, look at doing improvement bonds. With that, this is typically streets, maybe sidewalks, where a minimum of 20% of the project needs to be assessed to the benefiting property owners. And with that, the balance can be paid with taxes. And when you look at that minimum, it has to be at least 20%, but it can always be more than that. And that's typically where you would have an assessment policy that would give direction so it continues to be fairly consistent across each year and project. Utility bonds are typically paid with the utility revenues. Many times we see those do carry that general obligation pledge, though, to help get a little lower interest rate because you would promise to levy in the event revenues were not sufficient. Capital improvement plan bonds are many times for things like city halls, police stations, fire stations. And these are bonds that are paid with your general tax levy, but they do have an extra step where there is a public hearing required and also then a 30-day reverse referendum. There's a process with that if during that 30 days, unhappy residents collect enough signatures, they could force a referendum on whether to move forward with the project. You may, I don't know how far like news travels, but I know in the metro area right now, we're seeing that there's a lot of discussion with this. Owatonna's one that's been on the metro local news lately about really a little bit of a challenge on, they have some significant public safety projects and they're trying to figure out what direction they want to go moving forward, because there is a concern that there may be this reverse referendum if they go down the path of the capital improvement bonds. Street reconstruction. This is typically used for maybe like a mill and overlay or projects where you're not going to be able to meet that minimum 20% assessment. And with that, it's a similar process to a capital improvement. So again, there's a public hearing, and with projects like this, they're subject to the reverse referendum possibly. I'm going to jump and kind of combine tax abatement and tax increment. Both of these are bonds that can be issued for when either a tax abatement project is put into place or a tax increment project is put into place. You may see these for like development if you were doing the infrastructure for an industrial park or something like that. Tax abatement also, because it is fairly flexible, is one of the tools that we use to issue for it. If you can use tax abatement bonds for like a park or a swimming pool, and it basically is a way to allow you to levy taxes for those types of projects without going through a whole referendum process.
And then just one thing that I wanted to add, when we talk about improvement bonds and that 20% that you need to special assess against benefiting property owners, if you're not able to achieve that 20% threshold, what Rebecca is saying is there's other options out there in order to issue bonds to do your street project, to do your utility projects. I know a 20% threshold 10 years ago based on construction costs is a lot different than 20% of project costs in today's environment. Costs have just exponentially increased. And a lot of times when you have these assessment hearings, you get residents coming out in full force because it's sticker shock to see what that assessment amount is going to be on their property. So it's not a bad thing if you can't or you don't want to assess 20% of the project costs. You can still assess 10%, 15% for these other options, but there's other ways, other types of common debt products out there that you can use to be able to move these projects forward.
Absolutely. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on some of these, but for those of you who may have a local option sales tax, you are able to issue debt to be paid with future sales tax revenue. A lease revenue is one of those types of bonds that is paid by the annual appropriated funds. Where we may see this would be if you look to, I'll say I have a community about a year ago that went down the path and planned to do a capital improvement bond for a police facility. There was a lot of angst with that. And so they ended up going forward because they needed to, the elected officials felt it was a needed project. They didn't have the ability to wait until election time. And so they moved forward or switched to do a lease revenue bond for building their new police station. Equipment certificates. So you can use that for, we talked about it, vehicles, any type of equipment. We typically do not see equipment certificates issued for just general, like new computers and some of those smaller amounts, but they are something that, you know, is an option if ever needed. And then all of these are really falling under the general umbrella of Statute 475, which is the legal authority in Minnesota to issue debt of any type.
And then I would just add to that, I'm full of fun facts. So 475 is essentially cities are able to issue debt for just about anything. It's just whether or not do you have to go through a referendum, or is there an exception that you would be able to issue debt without doing a referendum? And so I believe under state statute, there's about 17 exceptions where you don't have to go out and get voter approval to issue debt. And a lot of these common types are part of the exceptions that I'm talking about. But I just wanted to throw that out there because, you know, I'm filled with fun facts. So
a couple terms that we'll just walk through because there is a lot of jargon sometimes with issuing municipal debt or bonds. Par is really the face value of that bond. So when we talk about the par value of the bond, that is the face value of what is going to be on your official statement and your resolution and the amount of the bond there. Principal is, again, you know, that amount that you're going to pay, that you are borrowing, or the face value, that is payable over those installment dates. So you're looking at, you know, what is your annual payment on February 1st of principal to write down the debt, just like with your mortgage or a car loan. As we continue with terms, again, kind of self-explanatory, but maturity is the date when the bonds are done being paid and are paid in full. So that final date, when you make your final principal payment. And then one of the terms, though, that is maybe not quite as self-explanatory or common is call, or the optional redemption date. We usually or many times refer to it as calling the bonds. And that is with municipal bonds, you have the ability typically to pay off the debt or refinance it at some date, it's going to be stated in your document prior to that final maturity date. And a call feature means that on date specific, you at that time could prepay your debt. You could refinance it for interest savings or for other reasons. And typically that means at that date, there would be no penalty on it. So the call date is that date you can refinance or pay off without having to pay any other penalty with it. And then the final item that I'll just touch on before I turn over to Keith is the official statement. And that is really your offering document. If you issue with an underwriter or take it out to a competitive large market to get the lowest bid on a bond, you're going to have a fairly lengthy offering statement that's going to talk about the bond, what the security is. It'll have a bunch of information just about your community, generally like your employers, your tax base, the debt you have. Typically it includes your audit, your budget for the year. So it's quite a lengthy document that bondholders or potential bondholders and underwriters are able to review to get an understanding of their community before they commit to buying your bond. When we distribute it, it is preliminary. And so that is the document that everybody is reviewing prior to the sale. And then after the sale, there are a few changes made to it to make it final and reflect exactly what happened with the sale on that date.
Well, and now I get the pleasure to go through, debt issuance players, who they are, what role do they play in the debt issuance process, who are they ultimately representing at the end of the day, and how they get paid. Later on in the presentation, we're also going to talk about some process and timing for what that looks like with debt issuance. But the first place that I want to start here is with the team and the professionals and attorneys that are going to be involved to help you through a debt issuance process. The first one that I want to cover here is the municipal advisor. So ultimately, you are required to work with a municipal advisor to issue debt. This goes back all the way to the housing crisis that we experienced in 2009 with the Dodd-Frank Act, throwing out some legislation previously for you. But essentially, all issuers are expected to work with a municipal advisor. A municipal advisor has a fiduciary responsibility to you. So we are obligated, we are required to act in your best interests, putting your best interests above ours. Our role is to ultimately help you with structuring, figuring out the timing, the terms, the method of sale with debt issuance. How should it be going about issue to the marketplace? Should we look at competitive? Should we look at negotiated? Or maybe work with a local bank to help you place that product within the market? Like I said, we ultimately represent your best interests, and we ultimately don't get paid until there is some type of transaction and proceeds are issued. So I always like to put that out there so that feel free to reach out to us sooner rather than later, because we love getting involved on the front end of the project so that we can help you figure out what is the best structure, what are the best terms that we should build into this, how many interest only periods should there be, when should principal ramp up and stuff like that, so that we can apply it to the anticipated revenue that you're going to receive. We just want to be involved sooner rather than later so that we can help and show the debt schedules and what that might mean from a tax impact to the residents and constituents within the community. The next player is bond counsel. So these are going to be the attorneys involved to help you with your transaction. They're ultimately reviewing the authority to issue. They're going to provide a tax opinion on whether or not this meets the purpose for public purpose procedures so that you can issue the tax exempt debt. They're going to be preparing all the legal documents, the resolutions, the closing transactions, and all the various agreements that go into a debt issuance. So They're vital to this process. And so like municipal advisors, most bond councils want to at least get engaged sooner rather than later so that they can start reviewing, what you currently have in place and what other approvals you may need to get from the city council or whatever authority that is issuing the debt. They represent your best interest here. They represent the issuer, and they're ultimately opining on all of these things for the issuer, but then the bondholders are ultimately relying on that opinion as well. Like municipal advisors, they also get paid through once the bond is issued through the proceeds with costs of issuances. So that's ultimately how they get paid. They're not sending you monthly or weekly or whatever invoices. They're getting paid once the transaction closes. The next player that I want to talk about is the credit rating agency. And this is very important if you're going to get a rating on your bonds. You don't necessarily have to get a rating on your bonds, but you might be able to realize some interest cost savings if you do end up paying to get a rating on your bonds and a rating for the credit profile of the city.
Oh, go ahead.
So they are ultimately a private for-profit company, and the three players here are S&P, Moody's, and then Fitch. They are independent and they're providing a credit opinion of the issuer, looking at your demographics, looking at your economy, and they're assigning it some rating for the benefit of the debt issuance. And then the bondholders are ultimately looking at that rating that they place on the city, that they place on the debt. And then that's how they determine what is the interest rate going to be? What is the risk that we're going to take on if we buy these bonds? And so that's a variable that plays in when bonds are placed into the market. And then ultimately in the second markets, when they start changing hands from who holds the bonds at the end of the day. Most likely, if you sell bonds, they're going to be traded frequently within the market after the underwriter initially takes them down. The credit rating agency also gets paid through the issuance of proceeds. So that is important to note as well. Did you want to?
I was just going to say with the rating, I think one of the discussions that you would have with your advisor is if it makes sense. And like he said many times, for most issues, it does help you get a little better interest rate, but there absolutely are times that if you're working with a local bank or you have a small amount that you're issuing, that maybe that rating wouldn't make sense. And so it is an analysis that you can have that discussion with your advisor and determine if the cost of the rating will be seen as a benefit with lower interest costs.
The next player that I want to talk about is the underwriter. These are the people who are ultimately buying the bonds. Most likely when they buy the bonds, they've already got investors lined up to purchase a portion of them, but they're going to be sitting on some of those bonds for some time as they try and sell and put them into the marketplace. But they're the ones who are ultimately the broker-dealer. They're purchasing the municipal security. It could be one entity or it could be a syndicate. And what I mean by that is it could be multiple underwriters working together to buy these bonds so that they're able to place them into the market quicker than if it was just held by one underwriter. They do play a vital role here because they're giving you the resources to do your capital projects. They're the ones buying these. They're the ones that are ultimately selling them to the investors and holding them in their inventory at the end of the day. I do want to point out that they represent their own interests. They're trying to make money here. So they do have to adhere to some suitability and fair dealing standards, but they don't have a fiduciary interest to make sure you're getting the best deal. That's where the municipal advisor comes in to make sure when they buy the bonds, is a reasonable rate given all of, the other transactions that we're seeing in the market. How does their pricing compare to the other people who ultimately bid on the municipal securities? The unique thing about the underwriter is they also get paid when the bond proceeds are issued, but it's a little bit different. It's not through cost of issuance. It's called a underwriter discount. And so ultimately, if you're putting bonds out into the marketplace, let's say, you're issuing $1 million of bonds. Well, the underwriter may only end up buying it in this example for $990,000 because their payment is going to be that $10,000 difference between the bonds that you're issuing and what they're paying on the bonds. And this can ebb and flow depending upon the different underwriters, but we're also looking to make sure that it's reasonable and they're not severely underpaying and making a windfall of money from these transactions. I guess the other thing that I should mention here, and I know Rebecca brought this up on the prior slide, is an underwriter could be a regional or national player. But if you're not issuing it to the competitive marketplace, if you're not looking to get significant amount of bids on the property, or not the property, but the bond issuance. And if you don't have a rating, you might be working with a local bank. The local bank then would come in and essentially act as the underwriter. They're the ones that are going to be buying the bond at the end of the day. So all of this would slightly change if a local bank is in the picture versus a regional or national underwriter. When it comes to issuing debt, the process and the timing, it can vary greatly. And what I mean by that is the longest time is going to come with planning and authorization. This could be a matter of days, this could be a matter of weeks, or it could be months to several years. It all depends on how big is this project. Did you go through a capital improvement plan? Did you go through a financial management plan to show, yes, we're able to fund this? This is going to be the impact to the constituents and the residents and the property owners at the end of the day. But as far as the planning and authorization to when you're ready to issue debt, this is the longest time when it comes to this process. So the next step would be marketing and sale of the bonds. From the day that we move forward with issuing bonds, you're going to essentially go to your council and have a set sale resolution. From that time to ultimately when we sell the bonds, that process typically takes about 2 months. In between those 2 meeting dates that we're talking about, there's several things that go on. We're working with the bond council, we're working with staff, we're working with the engineers to prepare the preliminary official statement. We're getting all of the various information that we need to put into the official statement through a general certificate that we send to you to get us information about the largest companies, the number of employees that they have, what are your tax rates, what are your tax levies, and then also what's your financial health and position, so that we're able to put that information into the preliminary official statement. We go through a whole due diligence process where to make sure that this information is accurate and truly represents the city or the county or the authority issuing the bonds here. We just want to make sure that all of that information is accurate and correct. And then we also have the rating call for this process as well, to get that rating prior to selling the bonds. And then once you get to that sale, you're going to ultimately have the rating and you're going to have your bond attorney's opinion before that sale. On the day of sale, that's when the final things come together, and when now we have to execute the ultimate transaction. And then whoever ends up buying the bonds, whether it's an underwriter, whether it's a local bank, that's when they ultimately start working to wire the funds to the municipality. The closing after the day of sale could take anywhere from 2 to 4 weeks. It just depends how quickly everybody can come together and execute all of those documents. But then the final thing is debt administration. And this is probably one of the most crucial things, because as municipal advisors, we want to make sure you're aware of your responsibilities going forward with continuing disclosure, with arbitrage and all of these other responsibilities, so that we don't miss a debt service payment, so that we're able to monitor the debt proceeds to make sure they're effectively spent on project costs. They're not being spent on other things unrelated to the project. So the biggest thing here is debt administration. And this is going to run the full term of the bond, whether we issue it for a 5-year term or whether we issue it for a 30 or a 20-year term. That's going to run the whole duration. As far as planning and authorization, the municipal advisor and the issue are going to be working on what's the amount that we need to borrow? How much cash should we bring to make sure that we have adequate reserves to cover our various policies that we have for the operating reserve requirements and so forth. We don't want to burden the community. We don't want to burden the issuer with bringing too much cash to a transaction that it jeopardizes them in the future to make various payments operating expense wise. We'd also work with the structure of the transaction. So the type, the term, the method of sale, and so forth. So ultimately establishing that time frame, the various meetings that we have to hit to be able to have that day of sale come together within that 2-month time frame so that you can get the proceeds that you need for the project when you have a draw request come in from a contractor. Say you're doing a street project. They start in June, the first draw comes in July. We want to work backwards to make sure that you have the proceeds from the debt issuance before that first draw is made, before that first payment request comes in. So it's working on when is the project starting, when is the first payment to the contractor supposed to happen, so that we can align to make sure you're not issuing debt prematurely, but you're still getting the proceeds within a reasonable amount of time to make payments for the various costs. As far as obtaining the legal authorization, this would work with the municipal advisor, bond counsel, and the issuer. Depending upon what the project is, what the authorization is, there's probably going to be several steps that need to happen. And we need to determine if we're able to issue as tax exempt. So that's working with the bond counsel through that process. The other portion here is, bond marketing and sale, and just the different types of various avenues that we could issue debt. Securities offering, we're going to the competitive marketplace. We're looking at placing this most likely with an underwriter. We're going to be looking for the lowest interest cost possible. When we take into account all the variables with underwriters and how they price bonds. If we're looking at marketing and selling these, maybe doing like more or less a direct placement, or you're working with banks and local institutions, you don't have necessarily an official statement, but you would have some type of a term sheet most likely so that banks can respond to that. I will add that, depending upon the amount that we're issuing, depending upon the term, could really influence, do we go to the competitive marketplace or do we look at local banks? And what I mean by that is, generally, if your bond amount is going to be under, say, like $700,000 or $800,000, that's where we're going to start having a conversation. Is it worth it getting a credit? Is it worth it going to the competitive marketplace, or should we look at a bank? But then we're also going to be looking at the term. What is the term of the bond as well? Most banks are looking at shorter term investments here, so they may not want to go beyond a 10-year term. So that's also part of the conversation as well, to determine the best offering that we can do with the debt product that we're working towards. And I know I kind of alluded to this at the beginning when I was talking about the various ways that we can go about issuing debt, but you have negotiated underwriting, which you're going to work with your municipal advisor, most likely to send out an RFP to select the underwriter that you want to work with. When it comes to negotiated debt issuance, it's really a story bond. There may be some more costs that come along with it. But if you have some unique feature or some unique element to your project that isn't common within the marketplace, and you need to have one-on-one conversations with an underwriter to explain the rationale, that's where a negotiated sale would come into play. If it's pretty straightforward, you're saying you're doing a street project, there's nothing unique about this, you don't necessarily have to do a negotiated underwriting. It's more cost effective to do a competitive underwriting because underwriters understand that it's self-explanatory to them. It's for a street. It makes sense. So you're looking for your lowest interest rate possible, and that's where you're going to save most of your expenses here. And then finally, when it comes to bond sale and closing, I know I alluded to this as well. Leading up to the sale, that's when we're going to have the rating. That's when we're going to have the opinion from the bond attorney. Day of sale, this is when we're finalizing rate. We're finalizing the structures. We're working to approve and award the bonds to the lowest underwriter, the lowest interest cost. We're finalizing all of that stuff. We're going to collect a good faith deposit from the underwriter, and then we ultimately get to closing, which generally takes about 2 to 4 weeks after the sale. This is where the funds are ultimately wired to you so that you have them on hand to pay for project costs. So in a nutshell, I know we covered a lot of ground here, a lot of territory, but just some final thoughts. When it comes to capital financing, you want to look at the pay as you use or the pay as you go model. Do we have enough cash to pay for this project? Are we going to be restricted if we use all of our cash for any future expenditures that might come up in the future? If so, then maybe you do want to issue debt for these one-off projects that aren't necessarily routine and where you're going to need sufficient cash to be able to pay for that. There's many reasons to ultimately use debt, but you really want to work with your municipal advisor. You want to work with your engineers. You do want to work with your bond counsel to make sure that you're doing everything right, you're doing everything proper, and you're taking into account all of the structural considerations that there may be. And prudent debt administration, making sure you have all the policies and procedures in place so that once you issue the debt, you're able to monitor these, and if anything comes up, you're able to file an event notice through continuing disclosure so that you're able to make your underwriters or bondholders who have purchased your bonds aware of significant things that have happened. Whether there's a rating reduction or a rating increase, or you unfortunately missed a debt payment. Hopefully that never happens, but we're looking at material events. And ultimately, seek guidance because it is complex. But really, that's what we wanted to cover here with our Debt 101 presentation. So with that, we can pause here. I know we're running a little short on time, but we can open up for any questions and answers.
And I also believe this will be available. The slides will be emailed out. Is that correct?
I plan to, I'll send out a copy of the slides
to do, and I'm not sure.
Yeah, no, I'll send a link to the recording and the slide deck, as well as a link to last month's recording if people missed that too. So either get that out later today or tomorrow. So, yeah. Any questions from those of you who are still on the call?
But I think, don't be afraid to ask questions and reach out. I think we say this every time, but there are no dumb questions. This is a world that Keith and I live in, but we know that probably thankfully you guys are not living in this world every day. And
I think the key takeaway is have a good
team
team working with you that knows what they're doing.
Yeah. We're here as a resource if any questions do come up. So do not hesitate to reach out.
Yep. All right. Well, if there are no questions, we'll let you go. And again, thanks for joining us today and hope to see you next month. Have a good day, everybody.
Thank you.